This is the story of Owen Clark and his wife Lydia Clark. They had built their life the way most people build furniture, from flat pack instructions, following the steps in order, assuming the finished product would feel like home. Owen was a man who measured success in spreadsheets and quarterly projections, who loved Lydia in the way he loved most things he valued. Consistently, quietly, and without much examination, Lydia had married him believing that steadiness was the same as safety, that a man who never raised his voice was a man who had nothing to hide. For 11 years, they shared a bed, a business district, and a particular silence that neither of them had ever found the words to name. What would unravel them was not a single betrayal, but the slow accumulation of all the things they had never said, and the moment Lydia decided to stop waiting for Owen to say them first. The kitchen inn, their Ashford home, smelled of coffee and toast at 7:15 every morning, and Owen had come to associate that smell with a feeling that was not quite contentment, but was close enough that he had stopped looking for the difference. Lydia moved around the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed the same sequence of motions for so long that she no longer needed to think about them. She poured his coffee 2 sugars, no milk, and set it at the corner of the island where he always sat with his laptop open, scanning overnight emails from the Singapore office. He said thank you without looking up. She said it's fine without looking at him. They had 2 mugs that matched and 6 that didn't. Owen had never noticed. He was 43 that autumn. Clark Logistics was in the middle of its most ambitious expansion in a decade, 3 new regional hubs, a technology partnership with a mid-tier freight firm in Rotterdam, and a presentation to institutional investors that Owen had been quietly constructing for 6 weeks. His mind lived in those numbers the way other men's minds lived in their children's school plays or their weekend golf handicaps. He was not an unkind man. He simply had a very large interior room dedicated to work, and the door to it was almost always open, which meant the other rooms received less light. Lydia taught design strategy at a consulting firm she had joined 4 years earlier, after their daughter Nora left for university and the house became suddenly, embarrassingly large. She was good at her work, precise, perceptive, with an instinct for understanding what clients actually wanted versus what they said they wanted. Owen had told her once, in the early years, that she was the best listener he had ever met. He had not said it since. Marcus Hale had started as a client of Lydia's firm. By September, he had become a friend of theirs both, the kind of easy, sociable person who fills silences without effort and who Owen appreciated for the same reason he appreciated well-oiled machinery: reliable, useful, low maintenance. Marcus came for dinner on a Thursday. They opened a second bottle of wine and talked about the Dutch freight market, which Owen knew intimately, and about which Marcus asked good questions. Lydia listened. She always listened. After Marcus left, Owen loaded the dishwasher and Lydia sat at the kitchen island with her wine glass and her notebook, the one she kept for what she called professional observations, though Owen had never looked inside it closely enough to understand what that meant. "He's sharp," Owen said, meeting Marcus. "He's lonely," Lydia said. Owen paused with a plate in his hand. He looked at her, actually looked, in the direct way that had become unusual enough to feel slightly startling. "You think so?" "He talks about ideas to avoid talking about himself. It's a specific kind of lonely." She made a small notation in her notebook. "You do the same thing sometimes." Owen set the plate in the rack. He did not disagree, which was not the same as agreeing, and both of them knew it. He closed the dishwasher and said he was going to finish the Rotterdam deck before bed. Lydia said goodnight to his back. She sat for a while after he left the room, her pen resting against the open page. The house was very quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but empty quiet, the kind that has texture and weight. She thought about the way Owen had looked at her just then, that brief, arrested attention, and how it had felt like accidentally catching a signal that wasn't meant for her frequency. She closed the notebook. Outside, it had begun to rain against the kitchen window in that particular autumn way, steady and indifferent, and Lydia watched it for longer than she meant to. By November, the Rotterdam deal was signed, and Owen came home that Friday carrying champagne he had already opened in the office, still carrying the fizz of it in his voice. He filled 2 glasses and handed one to Lydia and said we did it in the way that people say we when they mean I. And Lydia smiled and clinked her glass against his and said congratulations. And both things were true, the smile and the distance inside it. She had stopped telling him about her work in any detail around the time she realized he retained almost none of it. Not from cruelty. He simply had a finite amount of bandwidth, and she had gradually moved from the center of it to the margin, the way a footnote moves when the main text keeps expanding. She still told him things, surface things, the commute, a client's ridiculous request, something funny Nora had said on the phone. He listened in the way people listen when they're also reading the head tilts. The arrives at appropriate intervals. The eyes don't quite land. They were still kind to each other. That was the part that made it so difficult to name. One evening in late November, she came home to find him at the dining table with his laptop and 3 printed reports spread across the tablecloth. And she stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him work, and she thought, I have been standing in doorways watching this man for 11 years. She said his name. He said, hang on without looking up. She went to the kitchen and made dinner alone. They ate at the kitchen island because the dining table had reports on it. Owen talked about the investor presentation 17 slides, a 5-year projection model, a secondary slide about risk mitigation that he was thinking of pulling because it undermined the confidence of the primary narrative. Lydia listened, and she thought about something she had been thinking about for several months now, which was that she could hear the business problems with clarity because they were problems with structure and strategy. And she understood those, and she had been quietly thinking about what she would do differently if she were running a logistics firm with Owen's infrastructure and access. And she had been writing those thoughts in her notebook under the heading Professional Observations. She did not say any of this to him. You should cut the risk slide, she said instead. Not because the risks aren't real, because the people who need to be reassured won't be reassured by it, and the people who can handle complexity will have already factored it in. Owen looked at her. That's actually exactly right. It was the most focused attention he had paid her in 3 weeks, and they both felt the slight wrongness of that without saying so. Marcus Hale came for dinner again in December. This time it was just the 3 of them, and the conversation moved through several subjects before settling on an adjacent one, a gap in the regional logistics market that Owen himself had identified 2 years ago, but had decided not to pursue because the capital investment felt premature against the Rotterdam expansion. It's still there, Owen said, almost to himself. The window hasn't closed. Someone will take it, Marcus said. Someone always does. Owen refilled his glass. I'd rather it be someone I trust than a competitor. Lydia said nothing. She was looking at the wine in her glass. Later that night, after Marcus left, Owen went to bed and was asleep by 11:15. Lydia sat at the kitchen island for an hour and a half with her notebook open. She wrote 3 pages. At one point, she looked up from the page and out at the dark window, and she had the strange feeling, not guilt, exactly, but something adjacent to it, of being observed, of a weight in the air that wasn't Owen's steady breathing from upstairs. I don't know, she said quietly, almost to herself, to the dark window, and whatever was beyond it. I don't know what I'm doing yet. Maybe she stopped, pressed her lips together, like this story or subscribe or something. A small, uncomfortable laugh. Then she looked back at the notebook with the expression of someone who has said something they don't entirely understand and continued writing. The kitchen was very quiet. She wrote until the wine was gone and her handwriting had begun to slope leftward, which always meant she was tired and thinking honestly. Then she closed the notebook and went to bed and lay next to her husband, who was already asleep, and stared at the ceiling for 40 minutes, and made no decision yet. The conversation happened on a Sunday in January, which was appropriate, Owen thought afterward, because Sundays in January are already stripped of pretense, no occasion. No guests, nothing to perform for. Lydia asked him if he wanted to separate. She did not preface it with a fight. She did not build up to it through a series of escalating complaints. She sat across from him at the kitchen island with both hands around her coffee mug and said, "I've been thinking that we should probably separate. I wanted to ask if you felt the same." Owen looked at her. The coffee machine was still making small sounds in the silence after she spoke. "Is there someone else?" he asked. "No." She said it without offense because she understood why he'd asked. "It's not that." "Then what is it?" She considered this not performing consideration, actually thinking in the way she thought when she was trying to be accurate. "I think I've been waiting for you to want to know me again. And I've realized that's not something I should keep waiting for. It's not fair to either of us." Owen set his coffee down. He was a man who processed things quietly and thoroughly, who did not react before he had run the numbers, and so he sat for a long moment without speaking, and Lydia waited. "I didn't know you felt that way," he said finally. I know. There was something in the way she said it, not accusatory, just factual, that landed heavier than accusation would have. He understood in the strange clear light of that January kitchen that this was the problem she had told him, or tried to in all the ways that weren't direct speech, and he had not been listening in those frequencies. He had been listening for problems that announced themselves like quarterly losses clearly, numerically, undeniably. And Lydia had not been that kind of problem. She had been the other kind. He started. "Owen." She said his name gently. "I think it's been a long time. I think we've both been somewhere else." He thought about the dishwasher, the mornings, the doorway. He thought about all the times she had said goodnight to his back, and he had heard it and registered it and returned to the Rotterdam deck. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want to find out who I am when I'm not managing the distance between us." It was the most honest thing she had said to him in years, and it hit him the way very honest things hit people who have become accustomed to comfortable approximations, like a cold surface against fair skin. They talked for another 2 hours, not with raised voices, not with the theatrical machinery of a marriage dissolving in the way that films suggested marriages dissolved. They talked with the quiet exhaustion of two people who had once known each other very well and had gradually navigated by small and reasonable steps to a place where they no longer did. They divided the practical questions into categories and agreed to involve lawyers who were not adversarial. Lydia said she would stay in Ashford through March while she found an apartment. Owen said that was fine. Before she went upstairs, she paused in the doorway, the same doorway where she had stood so many times watching him work, and said, "I don't think you're a bad person, Owen. I just think you were very comfortable." He stayed at the island after she left. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried easily, and in that moment he examined himself for grief and found something more like the recognition of a loss that had already happened, the grief of discovering, too late, the specific shape of a thing you have let go of before you understood its weight. He sat there for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and began to work. The months after were quieter than Owen had expected, and that quietness was its own kind of information. He had assumed, without quite examining the assumption, that he would feel more. He had been married for 11 years, and when the marriage ended, he experienced something that felt less like devastation than like the sensation of setting down a weight he had been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. He found this unsettling in a way that the grief itself might not have been. He worked. He expanded the Rotterdam operation. He hired a new operations director named Stuart, who was sharp and quick, and reminded Owen, in his better moments, of how Owen had been at 35. He had dinner with his daughter Nora in March, and Nora was careful around him the way children of divorced parents learn to be, offering no allegiances, absorbing the shape of both her parents' new silences. "Are you okay, Dad?" "I'm fine," he said, and meant it, which troubled him slightly. Lydia, he gathered from Nora's carefully managed mentions, had moved into a flat in Whitmore, 40 minutes from Ashford. She had also, apparently, taken on new consulting work, something independent, outside the firm where she had worked. Nora mentioned it briefly and then moved on, and Owen did not pursue it because pursuing it felt like a kind of admission, and he had not yet decided what he would be admitting. He ran into Marcus Hale at a conference in Birmingham in April. Marcus was warm in the uncomplicated way he was always warm, and they had a drink at the hotel bar and talked about the freight market and the autumn season and several things that were not Lydia. Near the end of the evening, Marcus said, with the careful neutrality of someone who has thought about how to say something, "Lydia seems well. She seems like she's found her footing." Owen said that was good to hear. On the train back to Ashford, he looked out the window at the dark landscape and tried to identify what he was feeling, and found something complicated, not jealousy, exactly, but a particular variety of irrelevance. The sense that the world had continued to generate Lydia without his participation. It was June when he first heard the name. Stuart brought it into a meeting, casually, the way important things often arrive. They were reviewing the regional logistics gap, the one Owen had identified 2 years ago, the window that hadn't closed, and Stuart set a competitor analysis on the conference table with the manner of a man who is not sure how to contextualize what he is about to say. "There's a new firm," Stuart said. They moved quietly, they're positioned exactly in that gap. Owen looked at the document. The firm was called Meridian Freight Solutions. He looked at the founder's name at the top of the page, L. Clark. He sat very still for a moment. Stuart continued talking, but Owen's attention had narrowed to the name and the familiar initial in the particular way the world sometimes confirms the things you have been refusing to understand. He said, "Give me a minute," and Stuart left the room. Owen read the document. He read it carefully, the way he read things that required him to be accurate rather than comfortable. Meridian was a small operation, 12 employees, regional focus, capital base that was modest but sufficient. Their strategic positioning, however, was not modest. It addressed exactly the structural gaps in the market that Owen's own firm had identified and declined to pursue. The efficiency model was precise. The client acquisition strategy was unconventional in ways that worked. He recognized the thinking, not the specifics, nothing that could be taken to a lawyer without embarrassment, but the underlying logic, the framework, the particular sequence of strategic observations that led to these conclusions. He had heard it in his own kitchen. He thought about the notebook, the one she always called her professional observations. The evenings at the kitchen island, the conversations about his business, where she had listened with that quality of attention he had always taken for granted, because he had assumed it was directed at him rather than at the information. He sat in the conference room for a long time. What he felt was not anger, precisely. Anger would have been easier to manage. What he felt was something more like the experience of having a photograph developed that you thought was unexposed, discovering, slowly, that there had been light there all along, and that you had simply not been positioned to receive it. He closed the document. He told Stuart they would need to revisit the regional expansion timeline. Stuart asked when. Owen said soon. He drove home through the June evening and sat in his car in the driveway for 11 minutes. He noticed the time without meaning to, and then went inside and made himself dinner in the kitchen that still smelled, sometimes, of someone else's presence. He called her on a Tuesday morning in September, 9 months after the divorce was finalized. He had spent 6 weeks convincing himself that the call was purely professional. Meridian Freight Solutions had grown quietly, steadily, with the particular momentum of a firm whose founder understood how to build something without making noise about it. They had taken 3 clients from Clark Logistics in the past quarter, not aggressively, simply by being present in spaces that Owen had left open. The regional gap was closing around them, and Stuart's projections suggested that within 18 months, without a counterposition, it would close entirely in Meridian's favor. There were options. Owen had explored them. A legal challenge was the first one his board had raised, and Owen had sat with it for 3 days before setting it aside. He had read Meridian's structure carefully enough to know that Lydia had been meticulous. Whatever she had taken from their kitchen conversations, she had taken in the form of insight, her own synthesis, her own strategy, and had built something original from it. There was nothing actionable. There was only the clear, unambiguous fact of her intelligence, which Owen had been adjacent to for 11 years without fully registering its dimensions. The second option was a partnership negotiation. He called her on a Tuesday. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was the same careful, precise, with the slight formality she always used when she was monitoring her own reactions. Owen, Lydia, do you have 20 minutes? A pause. Not uncomfortable, just honest. I'm at the office. I have a meeting at 11. I'll be brief. He was standing at his window looking at the September street below. I imagine you know why I'm calling. I have a reasonable idea. I'm not calling to. He stopped, reorganized. I'm not calling to contest anything. What you've built is yours. I understand that. Silence. Then, okay. I'm calling because I think there's something structurally more useful for both of us than competition in this segment. I think you know the market well enough to know that too. Another pause. He could hear, distantly, office sounds on her end keyboard, someone's voice, a door, the ordinary texture of a working life. You want to talk about a partnership arrangement, she said, or an integration. There are several structures that might work. Owen, her voice was not unkind, but it was very measured. I want you to understand something before we have that conversation. All right. I didn't build this to hurt you. I want to be clear about that. He considered the view. The September light was thin and useful, the kind that illuminates without warmth. I know that, he said. And he did that was perhaps the most complicated thing about all of it. She had not done it to punish him. She had done it because she had needed somewhere to put herself. And she had put herself into something she was very good at, and that was, in the end, not something he could dispute. I also didn't build it to end up back in a position where your framework is the one we're working within, she continued. Any conversation about partnership or integration would need to start from equivalence. I understand that. Do you? He turned from the window. His office was familiar and orderly and, in this moment, slightly airless. I think I understand it better than I did, he said carefully. I'm aware that's not the same thing. The pause this time was different. It had texture. I'll hear what you have to say, she said finally. Send me an outline of what you're thinking. I'll have my people look at it. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. But it was not harsh, it was just accurate, which was how Lydia had always communicated when she was being honest. He said, I heard you're doing well. Another pause. Shorter this time. I am. I'm glad. He meant it. That was the other complicated thing. I genuinely am. There was a moment brief, and neither of them named it, where the conversation held still in the way that things hold still before they resolve into something permanent. Owen stood in his office, and Lydia sat at her desk 40 minutes away, and the distance between them was geographical and mathematical, and something else that didn't have a precise term. I have to go, she said. My meeting. Of course. I'll send the outline this week. Okay. A breath. Owen. She stopped. Yeah, nothing. I'll look for the outline. She hung up. Owen stood at the window for a long time after. The September street continued below delivery vans, pedestrians, the ordinary machinery of a city conducting its business. He was aware that what had just happened was not a resolution. It was a beginning of a professional negotiation with a woman he had shared 11 years with, who had sat at his kitchen island and listened to him with the quality of attention he had mistaken for devotion, when it was something more complex and more generous than that. Genuine interest, carefully applied. He had been the most important feature of her landscape for over a decade, and she had become furniture in his. And she had taken the intelligence she had been quietly accumulating at his side and built something with it, something real and structurally sound, and she had not needed him for any part of that. He did not know what they would become. Partners in the professional sense, perhaps. Two careful people in the same industry, managing a particular shared history with the efficiency that both of them were good at. Maybe something would grow out of a negotiation that was not purely professional. Maybe it would not. What he knew, standing at the window in the September light, was this. He had spent 11 years with a woman he had not fully seen, and she had spent 11 years waiting to be seen. And eventually she had stopped waiting and done something extraordinary with the waiting, and the loss was not the divorce. The divorce was just when they had signed the paperwork. The loss had been quieter than that. The loss had been all those mornings at the kitchen island with the coffee and the laptop and the thank you and the it's fine. All those doors he had left open to the workroom so the other rooms could never quite get warm. He picked up his pen and began to draft the outline. Outside, the light continued to thin toward autumn. It did not occur to him to wonder whether this made him sympathetic or not. It occurred to him that it was true, all of it, and that truth did not require an audience, which was the first useful thing he had understood about himself. In longer than he could accurately measure, he wrote, the room was quiet.